here was the first Negro to show up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it integrated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
1957, Alabama. In the United States, black Americans are challenging racial segregation. They're physically attacked and defied by Southern politicians.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
1957, South Africa. Segregation is being extended by a white minority government afraid of being swamped.
Do you think that the South African government's racial policy is right?
I really do, because we cannot mix with the lower nations at the moment, unless they are cultivated and educated and so on.
Do you feel yourself that the white minority can continue to maintain their position?
Most decidedly. Most decidedly.
Forever?
Forever.
This is the story of the fight for equal rights in two different countries. In both South Africa and the southern states of America, black men and women faced segregation that was backed by the force of law. The circumstances were very different, but in both countries, change only came after ordinary people took their protest onto the streets. It took nearly 10 more years in the United States for blacks to achieve the same legal rights as whites. In South Africa, it would take nearly half a century. In the land of the free, slavery had been ended 90 years before, and the United States Constitution promised equality before the law. But in the 1950s in the South, where 10 million blacks lived, it was the state laws that counted. The daily lives of the black minority were governed by a mesh of local laws still enforced to keep blacks and whites apart.
1957, it was government-sanctioned racism. You had formal barriers to jobs, to freedom of movement. The Constitution of the United States did not protect every citizen.
People were starting to talk about integration, but white supremacists like the Ku Klux Klan played on popular fears of what it could bring.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, throughout of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
The 13 million black South Africans were the majority, but they had few rights in their own country. 3 million whites had the best land and the wealth, and blacks weren't allowed to vote.
I think the natives left to the people who know how to handle them certainly is a fine fellow. I've had no trouble. I've been on this farm for 4 years now, and quite frankly, I haven't prosecuted one single boy. There was no need for it.
Black South Africans kept the farms and factories going, but the growing number of blacks in the cities was feared and resented by the whites. Christina Hadebe worked as a maid in Johannesburg.
They wouldn't let me use their plates and cups. I had my own enamel plate and an empty tin can as a cup. There was a dog's kennel out at the back, and my dishes were put next to the dog. It was as though I was a dog myself. They treated the dog better than a black person. As a black, you were the scum of the earth. You worked for these people. You cooked for them. They ate your food. But they despised you.
Ek is Afrikaner. My verhaal is die verhaal van 'n nuwe volk met 'n nuwe taal op nuwe bodem ontstaan.
The majority of the whites were descendants of Europeans who'd settled in southern Africa 300 years before. The Afrikaners had their own language, their own political party, and their own church, which taught that white superiority and rule over blacks was the will of God. Nico Smith was a theology student and a true believer.
They were the inferior people. They were the strange people. They had a different culture. And I also, to a certain extent, believed that they were the cursed people, of whom the Bible says that they were the descendants of Ham, and they were cursed. And so they must be the laborers. And I couldn't imagine that one should ever really associate with them or even touch them.
When the Afrikaner National Party won power in the 1948 election, they gave discrimination the force of law. The all-white parliament passed a series of measures that extended segregation, institutionalizing white supremacy into a system that became known as apartheid. In 1957, while segregation was being extended in South Africa, it was starting to come under attack in the United States. Arguing that the US Constitution rendered local segregation laws illegal, black Americans got the US federal courts to order schools to integrate. No blacks had ever been to the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. But 9 children became a test case to break the color bar. Ernest Green was one of them.
It was, at that time, the premier high school in the Mid-South. It always turned out large numbers of merit scholars, but it was a barrier. It was something that because I was a black kid, I could not attend there.
At first, the state governor used local reservists, the National Guard, to keep the children from setting foot in a whites-only school. Under pressure from Washington, he finally agreed to let them in.
We've just got a report here on this end that the students are in. That's right.
But when the white crowd waiting outside threatened to turn into a lynch mob, the children had to be evacuated to safety. Next day, President Eisenhower sent in the US Army to clear white objectors from the street and restore order. 16-year-old Ernest Green tried to go to school again, this time with an armed escort.
We were in a station wagon. In the front was an Army Jeep with a machine gun mount. The Jeep let us out. We got out. A cordon of soldiers surrounded us. We went down this walk, up those steps. It really was an exhilarating feeling that you had finally accomplished something. You could see the cameras and the people across the street, and that all of it was focused on the 9 of us going to this school. It was the realization that this was not the end, this was just the beginning.
Little Rock was a symbolic victory, though thousands of schools stayed segregated. As the civil rights movement spread across the country, it showed how mass action could succeed where court orders on their own had failed. Black Americans found they could start to change things when they joined together to boycott shops or employers who discriminated. At whites-only restaurants, they adopted sit-in tactics. In Tennessee, Bernard Lafayette was one of the protesters.
And would take seats quietly at the lunch counter. You would not say anything to anybody, but sit there until you're asked to be served. There was the waitress who was very panicky, walking up and down and very confused about what to do, and very clear that she was not going to serve us.
I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
Then there were these fellows with the ducktail haircuts, and they were walking behind us, so they would make cat calls. They would say, "What are you doing in here, jungle bunnies? You know, you get out of here. You're not going to get served in here."
And we sat at the counters, and I was praying when this lady, white lady, came and she put her cigarette out on my arm. So I calmed myself down. While I was calming down, she lit the rest of her matches and pulled my poncho out and dropped the lighted matches down my back.
Paul LaPrade was pulled off the seat of the lunch counter, and he was kicked and beaten on the floor. And so they decided they were going to make an example out of him because he was white.
I'm so glad. The police arrested the students who hadn't fought back, not their attackers. But the movement carried on. Within months, 50,000 had joined sit-in protests in 112 cities. In 1961, campaigners turned to the long-distance bus lines. Seats on the buses were segregated, like the waiting rooms. But volunteers calling themselves Freedom Riders ignored the rules and sat together. One bus was firebombed by whites. But groups of young protesters kept on traveling on the buses, including Jim Swerg.
I was going to sit in the front of the bus with Paul Brooks. Paul sat by the window, I sat by the aisle. The rest of the blacks and one white girl who went on, Salim McCullum, were going to sit in the back.
When the Freedom Riders crossed Alabama, Floyd Mann was in charge of state police and tried to give them protection.
We had placed 16 state trooper cars in front of those buses and 16 state trooper cars behind them. We also had an air reconnaissance flying over those buses just in case they'd put up some bridges or what have you and tried to sabotage those buses.
But at Montgomery, another police force from the city was meant to take over.
All of a sudden, as we got to the city limits of Montgomery, Alabama, all of the protection faded away. No more state troopers, no more helicopters.
As they drew into the bus station, a crowd appeared.
They sat on the bus for a little while, and I saw the mob begin to just build just like a kind of a river, you know, just growing.
You could see things in their hands, hammers, chains, pipes.
It was a frenzy. They just went, wow.
I'd get the nigger lover. I mean, I was the only white guy there.
They were screaming and hollering, and their faces were all frowned up until they grabbed Jim Swerg. And they took him and they knocked him over the rail. And they picked him up and they knocked him over the rail again. They knocked his teeth out.
I remember getting kicked in the spine and hearing my back crack and the pain. And I passed out again, and I woke up, and I was again in a moving vehicle with some very southern-sounding whites, and I figured I'm off to get lynched.
We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. Segregation must be broken down. You're under arrest. We're marching on.
As the sit-ins and arrests continued, the civil rights movement gripped America. By 1963, over 36,000 people had been sent to jail for protesting segregation laws.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary.
Come on. To freedom, come on.
In In August that year, 250,000 people, black and white, came to Washington to demand a Civil Rights Act that would finally guarantee their freedoms. Martin Luther King spoke from the Lincoln Memorial.
I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
In South Africa, the white government was working steadily towards another dream. An apparatus of racial control on a scale not seen since Nazi Germany was being honed and finessed.
Mr. White, just what does this policy of apartheid mean in practice in terms of the everyday life of the people?
You know, I think we put it this way, that apartheid is intended to keep the races apart in all sorts of ways. You know, residentially, you already have big native locations, residential segregation. Under the Group Areas Act, the attempt is now to separate out your Cape-coloured people, your mixed bloods, your Indian group, your African group, so that they're all residentially apart. This is apartheid, the state of being apart.
To make sure the races kept apart, everyone was required to register their origins. Sex and marriage between races was made illegal, and complex rules classified people who already had mixed blood.
White plus white gives white. But white plus anything else cannot give white. It can only give colored. Black plus black gives black, but black plus colored gives colored.
Justina Koa was a hospital nurse.
Where I started as a student nurse, one side was for the whites and the other side was for the blacks. White patients separately, white nurses and white doctors. And then this other side, it was black nurses, black patients. The white patients got the best of everything, from medicine, treatment, types of operations and everything. There was no communication whatsoever with the white side of the hospital. We did not know what was happening on the other side. It was a separate development altogether, as if it's a Berlin Wall.
There were strict rules on blood transfusions.
There was no way whereby a European would get blood from a black donor, because the very relatives, the patient's relatives, when they look at the bottle and they see that, goodness me, the donor is a black, a baboon, a native, oh no, and then it will cause a lot of row.
As part of the effort to confirm black Africans in their subservient role, black schools were given a new syllabus. Under the Bantu Education Act, they were to concentrate on practical household skills. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics? Asked the Native Affairs Minister. John Carney went to school in New Brighton.
All the other information about the outside world was extracted like a tooth out of our education system. What was left was a skewed sense of an education which prepared us to be good servants and nothing else.
What is it? It is a piece of soap. Altogether, what is it? It is a piece of soap.
You say, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be an architect. And your parents would say, those are dreams for white children.
In Johannesburg, there was staged last weekend the first move in a campaign that may lead to civil disobedience. Thousands of colored people went to attend a protest meeting called by the African National Congress.
Resistance to apartheid was difficult and dangerous, but the long-established African National Congress called a campaign of mass civil disobedience. In 1955, the ANC published a Freedom Charter which proclaimed, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. The government response was to arrest 156 ANC leaders and charge them with high treason. The trials lasted 5 years. Meanwhile, to ensure the physical separation of the races, non-whites were told where they could and couldn't live. Black settlements within white areas, termed black spots, were to be cleared and their people shifted out.
In the heart of Johannesburg, places like Sophiatown, which for years had been a threat to the public health and safety, were tackled with vigor and energy. It was alleged that the Bantu were dissatisfied and would refuse to move. In fact, they were happy to get away from these plague spots where they had been obliged to live in thousands.
But the song they sang showed how they really felt. Christina Hadebe lived in Sophiatown.
We sang this song to let them know we didn't want to move. We all stood together before we got into the trucks. The Boers surrounded us. They were armed. We said, we don't want to go to Meadowlands. We want to stay here in Sophiatown. But they forced us into the trucks at gunpoint. There was no choice.
Lorries transport the rejoicing Bantu whose hearts are filled with happy expectation. They're on their way to a new home, Meadowlands, where one can breathe freely.
The new townships outside the cities were to be the dormitories for black workers. And a new regime, the pass laws, was used to control their movements. To enter a white area, they needed a special stamp showing they had a job. All non-whites over 16, men and women, had to carry passes at all times.
This book was the only book which involved the life of a black person in South Africa. If you haven't got this book, you are nothing. It controlled the life of everybody. It controlled your work. It controlled your movement. It controlled your life as a whole. Without this book, you were nothing.
Any black South African could be arrested if caught without a passbook. Bongeni Dlovu was working in Johannesburg.
I couldn't really understand the police because they spoke Afrikaans. But all they'd say was, Kaffer, come here. They used to manhandle you and tell you you aren't wanted here. And they'd slap you, grab you by the scruff of the neck. Then they'd just throw you in the police van. The way they used to arrest us was very brutal.
In 1960, a fresh wave of protests were aimed at the pass laws.
There was a meeting to which we were all called to discuss these passbooks. Chief Lutuli said they must be burned because we don't want these passbooks. The whites don't carry them, so why should we always have to? We should be like the Boers, the white people, and not carry passes.
Thousands were prepared to take the consequences of burning their passes and joined the demonstrations. The Pan-African Congress, a breakaway group from the ANC, planned a mass meeting against the pass laws in March 1960 in a township called Sharpeville. What happened next tested the limits of peaceful protest.
So we went down to the pass office. As we stood there, everybody was pouring in from the township. Children, women, kids, you know. We were singing songs of African, Africa, singing, waiting for the reply. People dancing there, you know, enjoying. They were all happy, these people.
The crowd of around 15,000 surrounded a police station under the command of Colonel Pienaar. The police got nervous.
The police were standing outside when Captain Pienaar raised his baton. Some men were standing next to their armoured cars. Then they got in and closed the hatches. There was another line of police in front of the armoured cars. They had their rifles at the ready. He dropped his baton and they shot us.
After quite a while, everything was quiet. I pick up my head and I look around, I find everything is quiet. I find everybody, the bodies are laying down there. My uncle died there, my younger brother, and my sister. Those are the people who died there. I've lost people that I loved and people that I needed them. Sometimes when I sit down, I find my things are not going right. I say, if my mother was here, my uncle was here, maybe things would have went right.
"67 died that afternoon. Most of them were shot in the back.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Demonstrations against the government by Africans continue on an increasing scale, despite the decree of a state of emergency and the arrest of hundreds of leaders of the opposition.
In response to Sharpeville, protests broke out across the country. Convinced that non-violent demonstrations could achieve nothing, a wing of the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, began a sabotage campaign. But like the non-violent protests, the tactics failed. Mandela was arrested in 1962 and later in 1964 sentenced to life imprisonment on Robben Island.
Mandela had declared in court, "I planned sabotage because all lawful methods of opposition were closed. I have cherished the ideal of democratic society with equal opportunity for all. That is an ideal," he said, "for which I am prepared to die."
And outside the Pretoria court, Nelson Mandela's wife stood with the crowd around her singing the African freedom song.
"I shall never lose hope, and my people shall never lose hope. In fact, we expect that the work will go on."
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago.
In 1964, the same year Nelson Mandela was sentenced to prison, the Civil Rights Act introduced by President Johnson gave black Americans a real advance.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
The Civil Rights Act outlawed racial discrimination in all public places and gave black Americans the clear legal rights they'd fought for. But their very success provoked a final stand by Southern whites. Alabama's Governor George Wallace led the fight against an integrated America.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
When Governor Wallace stood in the door down at the University of Alabama, and he said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation now on, from now on, I said, no, sir. I said, you mistaken. It will not be segregation from now on.
The last great civil rights struggle in the South was waged to get all black Americans the right to vote. They had it in theory, but in countless southern towns, local registrars refused to put them on the voting roll.
Every time you would go down there, they would make you come back next month, come back in 2 months' time. Or you may have to come back next year. And they intimidated us so much so, until some people just wouldn't go back.
In Alabama, only 10% of the black Americans were actually registered.
The number one trick was to ask questions that no one can answer, like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, right? They asked blacks that, but they didn't ask whites that. So you asked impossible and stupid and inane questions of people you did not want to vote, knowing that these had no answers.
On this side, now right here you interpret. In other words, you tell what it means. Just write your meaning, your understanding of it.
Can you explain the Constitution? Can you tell us what the Constitution means, every word of the Constitution? Well, we didn't know. It did not matter whether you had a PhD degree or no degree. They just would not register Negroes.
Selma, Alabama, was a center of white resistance and obduracy. When a group of teachers tried to present their case at the registration office, they were stopped by Sheriff Clark.
This courthouse is a serious place of business. You seem to think you're taking it just to be Disneyland or something on parade. Do you have business in the courthouse?
We just want to pass.
Do you have any business in the courthouse?
The only business we had was to come by to the Board of Registers to register.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you were informed. You came down to make a mockery out of this courthouse, so we're not going to have it.
The group was led by C.T. Vivian.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing yourself and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
The idea was to beat people down, beat them away, destroy them physically, destroy their right to even work in a town if they had the courage to even try to register to vote.
And you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. No, you don't have to beat us. Get out of here.
The act by Sheriff Clark was the normal act of the South.
This is the kind of violation of the Constitution, the violation of the court order, the violation of decent citizenship. You can turn your back on me, but you cannot turn your back upon the idea of justice. You can turn your back now and you can keep the club in your hand, but you cannot beat down justice. And we will register to vote because as citizens of these United States, we have the right to do it.
To protest the continuing voting violations, a march was organized from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery.
You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
It was stopped by the police on the bridge out of the city. Television showed the scenes across the United States.
You see, as soon as people could see the faces, as soon as they could see what we were doing and what we were about, and understand that, so that it couldn't be lost in a plethora of words in the daily newspaper, right? Then they could see it. It was obvious. This must stop, and full rights must be given to all of our citizens.
Civil rights workers rushed in from across the country. The president pledged his support. And with all of America watching, a column of 3,000 marchers made another attempt to cross the bridge out of Selma.
We're going forward. One day
there would never be such unity and optimism again. Though black Americans still faced poverty and individual prejudice, it was the high point of the civil rights campaign. A new act was rushed through Congress, guaranteeing the right to vote. Within 10 years, the number of registered black voters trebled to 3 million.
We're going forward. We're going forward. One day we're going to be free. One day.
In South Africa, the news from the United States was an affront to staunch Afrikaners like Nico Smith.
They've allowed the black Americans to come and live amongst them. And they try to tell them that they are equal, but they are not equal. So they should have separated them and give them their own part of the country where they can live and where they can develop.
South Africa was now moving beyond simple segregation to completely separate development. The guiding genius was Hendrik Verwoerd.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily and perhaps much better be described as a policy of good neighborliness. Accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do.
In meticulous detail, the South African government devised a new racial map in which good neighbors would have as little to do with each other as possible. From the 1960s, the entire black population was allocated to one of 8 so-called tribal homelands. Each was to have its own citizenship and, eventually, its own independence. The homelands covered 13% of South Africa. The remaining 87% was for the whites. To complete the grand design, over 3.5 million South Africans were forcibly relocated. Bongeni Ndlovu was deported from Johannesburg to the KwaZulu homeland in Natal.
I can't say how we were meant to survive under the apartheid laws. My family lived a miserable life. My wife would often have to go to neighbors' houses to ask for food, and then I wouldn't eat, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough for the children.
The homelands were used as a vast labor recruitment camp for white South African employers.
What has he got to offer? He's got his labor to offer. If he doesn't work for the European, then obviously he will die of famine in his reserve.
But it wasn't easy to get off the reserves. Africans had to have an official job permit to go and work in white areas. And those who did were billeted in overcrowded and primitive township hostels, treated as outsiders, foreigners in their own land. The conditions black Africans were living under began to disturb even some of the government's own supporters, including Nico Smith. So much so that he left the National Party and began to speak out in opposition.
For instance, in the black township, I was shocked because there was nothing. There were no cinemas, no proper shops, no cafes, no playgrounds for children, no recreational opportunities. And every night I saw these thousands of black people streaming into the township, and in the morning they stream out again. So it was actually only a slave camp, you can call it.
With any political activity for blacks now banned, one of the few outlets for open protest was the theatre. A play called Sizwe Banzi is Dead was a landmark. John Carney was one of the actors.
There was so much confidence in the state and the white community that the situation of the black people is solved once and for all. It was at that time that Sizwe Banzi exploded on the stages of township halls, community halls, church halls, classrooms, and some private white little spaces within the cities, that suddenly there was a fever again.
You know what, Sizwe? If I were to tell you the troubles they gave me, before they could put the right stamp in my book, Born in This Town. The troubles they gave me before I could get a job to stay alive, born in this area. The hell I went through before they could give me this two-roomed house, born in this country. Jesus Christ, we start screaming the whole bloody night.
Why is there so much trouble, Mr. Buntu?
We knew that this has become a powerful political weapon in educating our people, in informing our people, in giving our people back their own voices, in giving them the confidence to stand up and talk about it. For the first time, people in shebeens, in schools, in churches began to refer to these issues, not necessarily the play itself, but to talk about the plight of the black people under the pass laws.
Next time that bloody white man calls you a boy, don't run up to him and lick his ass like we all do. Turn back and face him. White man, I'm a man, not a boy.
In 1976, open opposition surfaced again, sparked by a change in the schools.
Okkie is diep in gedagte terwyl hy hankend aanstaap skool toe.
The government said that from now on, all lessons would be taught in Afrikaans, the language of apartheid.
Afrikaans was difficult as a subject. So we couldn't imagine having to do subjects like history to be converted to geschiedenis and mathematics, wiskunde and all what have you. So we had to indicate that we don't want Afrikaans. And initially, our aim was not to destroy. The aim was a peaceful demonstration.
In June 1976, thousands of schoolchildren took to the streets of Soweto. The new wave of opposition was led by the young.
Suddenly, a tear gas went off. We didn't understand what was tear gas. As we were retreating, trying to resist, tempers fled and we started throwing stones to the police.
Nurse Koa's daughter was caught up in the violence.
And the children were around there and running away, running this way. And all these mothers from here, they would stand outside here and cry, stop, stop shooting our children, stop shooting our children. And the children were running all over here and coming to our houses and hiding themselves.
We went on burning properties, everything that was owned by whites in the township. Post office, municipality office, it was just a target because it was the government's thing, so we had to destroy all of those. We went to those shopping centers which were like on fire and we were looting, and to us is we were taking what belonged to the white men, what belonged to the system.
Hundreds of young people now cross the borders to join ANC guerrillas training abroad. Those who stayed followed the ANC instructions to make the country ungovernable. And a new mass movement, the United Democratic Front, kept up the pressure for the release of a leader the young had never seen.
We know Mandela. He's a leader, he's not a terrorist, and he shall never be one. But as long as the government does not want to release Mandela, there shall be no peace in this country. Mandela must be released unconditionally, and with all the political leaders must be released.
As the government held out, South Africa became an international pariah. One by one, foreign companies withdrew investment, and foreign governments imposed sanctions on trade. Within the country, militant trade unionists staged a series of political strikes. Tournament Vusani was in the car workers' union.
I told my wife and my son, look, we are at war now. So we've got to make sure that we don't use too much money. The only thing we should do now is to buy basic food in order to save so that we can survive. Because we don't know how long this struggle will take. And it might end up with us losing our jobs. So you must expect that.
The strikes began to take their toll. Tournament Vusani lost his job.
Sacrificing that much has something in return that will happen to the one who's oppressing me, forcing him to give up.
Faced with a crippled economy, the government began secret talks with the ANC. Then a group of white businessmen met ANC leaders in exile.
I think we found enough ground between us to make the prospect of further talks quite valuable, I think.
In 1990, the government responded to the mounting pressure for the release of Nelson Mandela. President F.W. de Klerk spoke at the opening of Parliament.
The government has noted that Mr. Nelson Mandela has declared himself to be willing to make a constructive contribution to the peaceful political process in South Africa. I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally.
With Nelson Mandela's release on the 11th of February, South Africa seemed on the way to a black majority government. It was news most black South Africans had thought they'd never hear.
I don't know what can I say, man. I'm so happy. I'm very, very happy. I feel like a drunkard. I am so happy that I feel drunk.
I didn't drink to celebrate. I only had my tea and my cigarettes. But in my soul, I was overjoyed because we had done this thing now. And now we were going to move on.
In Soweto, Mandela acknowledged the part South Africans had played.
It is not the kings and generals that make history, but the masses of the people.
Ahead lay 4 more years of division between blacks themselves and between the ANC and the government as they wrangled over the transfer of power.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to demonstrate to you how to go about with voting.
When an election date was finally set, people who'd never had democracy had to be taught how to vote.
Excuse me, how can we vote when we have no democracy here?
This is a ballot box. My sister here is going to demonstrate for us.
Any ballot paper without an official stamp is not valid. Fold your ballot paper so that it fits into the ballot box.
On April the 26th, 1994, they could exercise that right for real.
We didn't sleep because we felt if we slept, we'll be late, because a lot of people were going through the voting polls. When I woke up at about 4 o'clock, we saw about 3 long queues. We couldn't even know where they were ending.
It was as even a dream. I couldn't believe it, that it has become possible. I thought that these whites will never be willing to stand in one queue with black people. We were so used to it. Blacks and whites stand in different queues. Now all of a sudden we were in the same queue. And I thought for so long that it looked as if it was impossible. And now the impossible has become a reality.
When you were alone in that little box, it was like you were in heaven already. And then when you had to take separately, it was so funny. And you wouldn't, you thought, it's me voting, my hands voting for whoever I want to vote for. Really, it was wonderful. Unforgettable.
With 18 million people entitled to the vote for the first time, an overwhelming majority swept Nelson Mandela and the ANC to power. All South Africans now had equal rights.